why do the NGOs love community? Like in the statement that I read earlier from Diane Morales, she talks about how like her some of her staffers, like this was such a painful political moment because it felt like family.
Mm-hmm.
What's up with like the family talk and the community talk? And I'm looking at you, Damage Magazine, Ben Fong. What's up with the family in corporate America?
We need the Freudian explanation.
Yeah, in the NGO.
But I mean, in all seriousness, like something that I really liked about your guys' piece is you point out at one point, or you know, it's just a line, but you say something like, "Go to any nonprofit website, and like within 10 seconds of scanning it, you'll find some sort of invocation of community."
Yeah.
And we've addressed this like to a certain extent on the show before, but what's with the nonprofit fixation on community, and perhaps more importantly, like what does that obfuscate?
Yeah, I think that it's something that has I evolved over time for sure, and has at different points in time meant different things. And I think that, you know, originally, or not originally, but to kind of go back to the 60s, and this also, you can trace this thread back really to Herbert Hoover. There's this idea that part of what's wrong with social welfare and why we can't fix these systemic social ills is that our institutions are just not responsive enough to people. They don't, for whatever reason, they don't really know what's wrong with people's lives. And so therefore they come up with these clunky solutions, they don't administrate them well, and that's why we still have poverty. And so the notion of community was meant to signal this different approach to social welfare, where administrators and organizers would be legitimately connected to the people, and therefore actually be able to respond to their concerns. And this also, I mean, it connects so much back to the technocratic aspects that we talk about of NGOs, because it's also connected to this idea that the reason that we still have systemic social rot is because we just don't know how to fix it. And if only we could give people the right information, then they would have it. And there's this idea that the community, which no one can actually define, and in fact is a highly political term that enables actors to define their own scope of action while pretending that actually they just found this community. And you know, there's some sort of organicness to the solutions that they've found because it's coming from the community. So it allows people to posit that they're genuinely listening to people, when in fact they're constructing their own plane on which to do political action, and also through that process they're constructing who is actually in charge of the community. And so it allows, you know, nonprofit actors, but really almost anyone who uses this term. This is not even, nonprofits do love the term community, but this isn't a process that's specific to NGOs, but it allows them to pick and choose who gets to speak for the people who they would like to say that they represent.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you ask activists today, you know, why we use the word community so much, I imagine the standard answer would be to point to the community control programs of like the late 60s, and to point to that as a you know, something that the left ought to emulate. And I think that there's sort of two problems with that. One, and here I'd just sort of recommend Karen Ferguson's Top Down, which is about the Ford Foundation. The first thing is that those community control programs were co-opted by foundations, and in a way that were you know, inimical to the aims of the community actors themselves. And so there's a sordid history there. But I think the bigger thing is that since then, the sort of largest nonprofits and community organizations are community development corporations. And these are typically organizations like, you know, embedded all over the country, that are meant to, you know, get for-profit developers and, you know, community leaders in the same room to sort of like hash out social issues. And the problem there, of course, is that the people who get represented in those organizations, which have the sheen and the authenticity of the word community, are generally elites and not the people in the actual geographical areas that they're supposedly representing.
Right. Well, so actually on that point, I mean, I think I guess there's two parts to this, because the first is that community. I think you guys kind of covered the previous question very well, but like there's the community in the sense of like, oh, it's the people that I have relationships with and I know that are not in my family, they're in my neighborhood, we take care of one another, we look out for one another, something like that. And then there's just this very amorphous, the community, and there's people that fit into the community because of something that maybe they did, maybe they didn't do, maybe it's just some obscriptive identity thing, and okay, you're now in the community. What kinds of alliances does the NGO model of community building actually construct? And how are those different from the kinds of alliances that the left typically has built and wants to build?
Yeah, so I think this is kind of another example where this is something that has changed over time and has been argued about. But I would say where we are now is kind of where we left off going into the 70s, where what the community is and what kind of alliances it means is the community is basically a series of groups that are represented by a leader. And that leader has the ability to articulate the concerns of the people. And what a coalition is, what a community coalition is at this point, is a group of leaders coming together and basically hashing out, my people want this, my people want this, let's come to some kind of compromise and say that this is what the community as a whole wants. And in practice, what that means is that often leaders are elites, are people who have some kind of existing power or authority over localities to be able to assert themselves as a leader for various reasons, chiefly because they control community resources. And so in effect, what that does is it allows people who are already elites in their locality to posit that they're forming these grand alliances, which are basically cross-class alliances, where actually elites are in complete control over what the coalition says and does. And just to take that even a step further, you can have someone who is a local elite, say because they have a construction company and so therefore have some kind of ability to control development. But just because they have power in that community doesn't even mean that they will reasonably be able to assert their community's, wishes over other sources of power, chiefly financing that comes from national or international banks. So it's not even a good method for local elites to control their communities against other more powerful elites.
I mean, I think the short answer there is that community serves as a substitute for class. That, like, instead of talking about community, we should just talk about class, which would much more accurately, I think, represent political interests within any supposed community. Just briefly, because I know Melissa probably doesn't want to talk about this, but Kale, you asked about the psychoanalytic dimension.
Yes, let's do it.
I think that there's something very appealing in community. I mean, I think Eric Hobsbawm called community one of those vapid phrases of lost and drifting generations. And I think that we hold on to community so much because it's not there, because we're highly atomized and we want a community. But the problem there is that, capitalism is really good at recuperating languages that we like, languages of humanism. And, those love is love yard signs that you see around liberal neighborhoods, it's hard to disagree with all that stuff. That stuff is good, it's fine. But the way in which it's used to justify a certain project, I think that's what's sort of pernicious about it.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I was interrupting to ask if you own one of the signs.
In this house, we believe.
Yeah.
I do not have one of those signs.
Gotta do some more work.
So I want to shift gears just a little bit to talk about whether there's an effective way for the left to work with nonprofits, because I think that we've sort of identified a lot of the pitfalls, but obviously, as we pointed out before, a lot of people who are on the left work in nonprofits, right? I myself have worked at nonprofits and at foundations in the past. Jacobin, I think, is technically a nonprofit. Organizations that we love, like Labor Campaign for Single Payer, Labor Notes, I think that they're all nonprofits. And again, I think that you're really clear in your work that, you're not disparaging the work that these groups are doing, let alone the individuals who work for them. But in thinking through some of these structural problems, do you guys see any way that we can smartly engage with nonprofits?
Yeah, I think that, whatever your opinion of nonprofits is, at this point, it is impossible to do any kind of political activity and not engage with some nonprofits. And part of that is because, as we mentioned, it's really the structural constraints from nonprofits ultimately derive from funding structure. So there's plenty of nonprofits. Plenty is maybe a stretch. There are nonprofits who are not funded by elite institutions. And those are the ones that the left should prioritize working with. And I think that, DSA is kind of an interesting example of this, where DSA is a 501c3, it's a nonprofit, but it's funded by membership dues. And so that means that it, even though it's still a nonprofit, ultimately it's controlled by its members. It's controlled by the people who, volunteer for the organization. And the more kinds of nonprofits that we can seek out that are like that, the more successful the left will be at avoiding all these dynamics that cause conflicts with nonprofits' ability to actually confront the profit motive.
The coalition around National Nurses United that's fighting for Medicare for All, I think, is a good example of this. NNU convenes the table around which a lot of different organizations exist, including the Labor Campaign for Single Payer. But there are a lot of nonprofits that are there, the Center for Popular Democracy, and so there might be productive avenues of working with nonprofit and union collaboration, provided that I think unions are in charge. That being said, I think that there is a tendency to channel a lot of the activism into the traditional nonprofit ways. So prioritizing insider lobbying, prioritizing media campaigns, social media campaigns, and engaging in less confrontational tactics. So I think anytime you're dealing with nonprofits, they're going to want to domesticate and channel any kind of dissent into avenues that they deem to be quote unquote productive.
All right, so we're gonna do a little thought experiment. Imagine we're all sitting in the DSA meeting right now. We're gonna transport ourselves to it's the AC isn't working. It's really hot. It sucks. But
I've actually been in those meetings like many times.
I know. That's why I know you can do this thought experiment right now, Mel.
If the AC isn't working in Phoenix, then there's no meeting.
Okay, well we're talking Brooklyn or something. We're not, which is still really hot.
Coastal elites.
Yeah, we're talking coastal elite DSA meeting. It's really hot, but the world is fucked. So we know that we have to do our part and we have to be there. Is the social justice language and the community talk and the localism, is all of this a problem for bringing new people into the room with us, particularly working class people? Because if I'm going to suffer through the poorly ventilated DSA meeting, I want to bring new people into this. That it's not. I'm not doing this because it's fun. I'm doing this because it's politically necessary, because we have a really horrific social circumstance right now. So, I think we should. I mean, my sense is that we should be fairly. What's the word I want? mercenary about these things, right? That we have certain political goals and we need to do the things that help us get as close as we can to achieving those goals as possible. Are we shooting ourselves in the foot?
Yeah, so I think that it is yes and no to your question. And what's actually more pernicious about NGO language is that it is not 100% alienating, because, you know, some of it, I was thinking about this a lot while you guys were talking during your segment, and some of it is alienating and, you know, just straight up confusing. And sometimes that has to do with terms that nonprofits just come up with and then expect everyone to know. Sometimes it's for really more boring technical reasons, that the way that they want to talk about politics and society is in this just highly specialized technical way that just no one, unless you have a master's degree, could possibly understand. But then a lot of it assumes the language of common sense. And that's actually, I think, even more dangerous. And this, you know, some examples of this, I think, are NGOs' emphasis on citizen engagement. Who would be against citizen engagement? You know, we're people who talk about making structures more accessible, making it possible for citizens to genuinely participate in decision making. And so hearing a term like citizen engagement, it's not obvious why that's not compatible with the left. And in fact, on its face, it's not incompatible with the left. Right. And the problem is really is more so the way that these terms are then taken and then put through these routinized processes that are not only alienating processes, but are designed to completely disempower people and to make it clear that they're not actually, they're basically doing the opposite of whatever the term is meant to invoke. And, you know, citizen engagement in the nonprofit world often means having some kind of public forum where all of the speakers are carefully picked out in advance because they represent a very specific viewpoint, and then it's open to the public, and citizens engage because they sit there and listen to people talk. And that's what citizen engagement is. And so on its face, it's not bad. But when you actually go through the process of how they conceptualize what citizen engagement is, it's incredibly alienating, because you realize this isn't engagement at all.
I totally agree with that. And I think that's what's most pernicious about it, that sure, you know, the common features of like PMC language that we all love to ridicule can be quite alienating. But if anything, there has been a systematic investment in developing public forum kinds of strategies that are non-contentious and friendly and inviting. The Ford Foundation was the sort of first to explicitly, you know, theorize political conflict in terms of like, you know, as like a sort of pre-modern impulse that needs to be done away with. But the Kettering Foundation, the Pew Foundation, they've invested a lot in, you know, the so-called civic renewal movement, which is specifically about developing strategies and tactics for putting on public fora that lead to not debate but consensus. And you know, they take the results of those meetings and they nicely package them for city council representatives and whatnot. But the whole point is to get rid of any kind of debate. It's to get rid of any kind of conflict. And those kinds of spaces, when you first go, people are super friendly. I mean, nonprofit workers are super friendly at first, and they're inviting, and they want to be so. And they don't want anything to get too heated or for debate to get out of control. And so I think that the problem is not that it makes political spaces uninviting, but it makes them unproductive. You know, I mean, given the features of NGOism we described earlier, there's going to be a systematic avoidance of conflict and taking on the dominance of the profit motive. And given that, the problem is not that it's an uninviting political space, but that it's going to ultimately be an unproductive political space if you're talking about a left political space.
Right. So different question. What is the role of international NGOs? Is that any different than what we've been talking about? So things like Oxfam or Doctors Without Borders, do they also fit into this critique?
Yeah, they definitely do. And we didn't talk about this as much in the piece, but there's a long history of, domestically, I would say sometimes it's more confusing. Abroad, it is almost blatant fuckery. I mean, there's no other word to really describe. I would say, there's been a lot written about the Green Revolution, where there was a lot of nonprofit funding in experimenting with different agricultural methods abroad. And effectively in that case, it's almost barely a nonprofit process. It's so subordinated to for-profit capitalist motives, but is called experimentation or demonstration. So abroad, it's almost more naked, I would say.
I would guess the term NGOism is more familiar in the international context than the domestic. I think people tend to use the word nonprofit or foundation here, to a lesser extent, third sector. But we do focus in the article on the domestic scene, and it's a huge area for research. In the intro of the article, we explicitly sort of bracket the international considerations. We also bracket the academic considerations, and that's a whole basket that we're not going to get into. But in the early 20th century, foundations were very explicit about forming a large variety of sort of pass-through organizations that are meant to influence academia, and they still exist, and they still give away a lot of money. So there's a lot of things in this sort of general wheelhouse that we don't really explore.
Yeah.
Jen, you're muted.
Do this every time.
I was muted, so I couldn't tell you were also muted.
Yeah, just a chain of mutes. Anyway, I was gonna say, I want to end with just kind of a broader question, and I don't think we'll get to the exact answer here tonight, obviously, but I think you've been really good about identifying like what we might call like the NGO trap, right? As we were saying, like these sort of structural constraints that make NGOs basically pretty difficult to reform from the inside or on a piecemeal basis. So, what is the solution? Like, how do we break out of this mold? How do we revive? I mean, I guess part of the answer is reviving mass organizations, right? And I know that's like a different, a whole different segment or like a week's worth of segments. But what are some kind of practical solutions, if you guys have any? I mean, should every leftist who's working for a nonprofit just quit and join a union, or
or should they form a union at the nonprofit?
Just ask Diane Morales.
Yeah.
It's a difficult question, and to go back to what we were saying at the beginning, we don't want to make it seem like this is the problem for the left, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is definitely an internal obstacle, but the historic defeat of the working class is the problem that we're dealing with, and this is a secondary problem. So I think it's best not to make. I don't want to say that. It's best not to overly generalize about the nonprofit sector and think that any organization with a C3 or C4 status should be excommunicated or something. The problem's both more and less serious than that, I guess. But just to address, Jen, your question about what to do about it. It wasn't that long ago that we were pretty clear about what foundations were. In 1916, the Rockefeller petitioned Congress to charter their foundation, and they wouldn't do it. Rockefeller actually had to go to New York State to charter the foundation at first. And that should give you some sense of just how odious the Rockefeller name was. So much so, I mean, imagine Bill Gates going to Congress to charter his foundation and them saying, sorry, you're a vile person and we want nothing to do with you, right? It's a sea change in how we treat these things. And, you might say, oh, well, that was 1916, that was a long time ago. But as late as the 1950s, there were congressional hearings about the overreach of foundations that were supported on both sides of the aisle. and you read the transcripts of those hearings, which unfortunately didn't really go anywhere politically, you read those transcripts and they're just as brutal. I mean, they saw foundations as a real threat to American democracy. And then, you know, beginning in the 50s and 60s, as foundation funders and activists became more cozy with one another, that kind of critique was lost. And we aren't, I think, as critical of the foundations as we ought to be. So I think part of it is just being clear, like what this sector is and the ways in which it is undermining left politics.
Yeah, and just to add to what Ben said, I think in a lot of ways, the growth of the NGO sector is so much a symptom of neoliberalization and the changes in our social welfare state. And, you know, those changes are not just things that affect the structure of the state and of delivery of social goods, but it's also the fact that under neoliberalism, there is such an overaccumulation of wealth that, you know, people have billions of dollars to invest in these social initiatives that allow them even another degree away from their capitalist firm to control what society looks like and how it disperses and distributes its goods. So in a lot of ways, what this is the story of is another piece of why we need, why we need a mass movement, why we need a strong state, why we need publicly owned and run institutions. But then on the other side, I think what's important about this story is that, you know, NGOs are here now, and they're a huge sector of the economy. I mean, millions of people are employed by NGOs. And so now as we're trying to rebuild the left and think about, you know, how can we democratize society and how can we make sure that public goods are genuinely public goods? Now we have another layer of institutions with their own interests that, you know, don't necessarily want that to happen. And so, you know, it's kind of, it's something that it's not as simple as looking back at the New Deal and saying, let's do that again and let's just create these public goods because they were really, you know, creating them. Now we have to figure out how do we contend with these additional institutions that have cropped up and are really not meeting social needs, but still have their own interests in existing.
Right, and it's just what you're saying right now, kind of one of the things that struck me is just how compatible the like NGOism is with neoliberalism. And neoliberalism is basically just like, you know, whole hog capitalism. It's like capitalism uninhibited to just, you know, it's capitalism in the period of ripping apart the gains that working people won over the, you know, over the last 150 years. And so to try to have a different society, to build a new left, to rebuild the labor movement and to rebuild the welfare state, and to effectively combat NGOs and NGOism, maybe not NGO, but NGOism, the fact that NGOism, it has to be an anti-capitalist perspective. It has to be an anti-capitalist politics. It has to be a politics about working class power, because that's how you got the other kind of social arrangement of having a welfare state, of having you know, a greater standard of living for working class people. It didn't just come out of you know, the liberal do-goodery of the progressive era. It was effectively class conflict. And so I don't know. I mean, maybe this is just another question of it. Like, do we have to basically go full class conflict in our politics, or can there be something less? Do we even want something less, or can there be something less conflictual that can mitigate the effects of NGOism?
Yes, class conflict. Yes.
Cool. Just want to make sure it was said. It's Jacobin. I just thumbs up.
It's a good Jacobin note to end on. No, I think that there will always be plenty of people who are wanting to recuperate class conflict into a more positive direction. You know, the progressives that were oftentimes the architects of New Deal programs were, I mean, way better than contemporary progressives. But their hand was forced in a certain direction, and that was the sort of like key driver. So I would co-sign and say, yes, the left should be about class conflict and, the kind of domestication of dissent that NGOs encourage. It's always going to lead in the same direction, which is a reaffirmation of the status quo.
Yeah.
So if you guys have like another 2 hours, I wanted to talk to Ben about psychoanalysis, and Mel, we have to finish discussing our Capital Volume 2 chapters. So we're going to do that live.
The volume that everyone loves.
Yeah.
And definitely reads cover to cover.
That's the content your viewers crave, is
Right.
listening to Kayla and I read a paragraph of volume 2 and just saying, what the hell's he doing here? I don't know. It's probably about profit.
And then afterwards, Kayla and I can talk about our dreams.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have a good dream you can share, Ben, before we leave? Before
Not
you leave?
publicly.
Okay. So good dreams that you will not hear. Thank you both so much. I do want to stress, like, this new issue of Catalyst. Here, I'm gonna give a little promo. The new Catalyst is really good, and people should buy it and subscribe to Catalyst. And it's especially good because of the essay that Mel and Ben wrote. People read that article and share it, and then do better.
That's a takeaway I want. Do better.
Do better.
All right. Thanks, guys.
All right,
All right,
take
thanks
care.
so
Have a
much.
good night.
Bye.
All right. Fun.
I think actually we linked to their Catalyst article in the description box below. So definitely give that a read. I thought that was a great discussion. They really hit on, I think everything that is sort of problematic, or just, again, the pitfalls of the nonprofit sector, which, again, they're really clear in their article, has nothing to do with the intentions of anybody involved in nonprofits. But it's a larger problem that unfortunately has sort of arisen in a moment when these, once strong mass institutions, mass organizations, like labor unions, and even, just large kind of member organizations have been on the decline. So,
I mean, even as they said, even though NGOs and NGOism isn't the primary problem that the left or working people or anyone really faces right now, it was honestly, and just from my experience reading it, like, it was really useful and enlightening to understand effectively, like, why, whether it be kind of how privatization has played out, or just how ubiquitous this this language and this worldview is, like, just coded on everything. It then helps to understand, like, and think more analytically clear about, like, okay, what are we up against? Who's our enemy? It's still capital, still the ruling class, and to what extent is this a actual type of politics that may or may not be inhibiting our political strategies and dealing with and confronting the ruling class. So I found it really useful.
Yeah.
I hope you guys did. I hope, if you're still watching an hour and 25 minutes into this, I hope you appreciate it. Sorry there is no psychoanalysis chat, but
to be continued.